Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. Great to kick off Black History Month with you on this Tuesday, February 1st. And tonight, we're talking about how public schools teach race and identity. Florida could soon prevent classroom conversations about sexual orientation or gender identity, especially in elementary schools. Another bill to change how race gets taught has the support of Florida's governor. And in Texas, some parents and lawmakers want to remove a growing number of books from school libraries. How should parents and school boards guide students through controversial topics? We'll share your thoughts just ahead. Also tonight, relief is on the way for parents waiting to vaccinate their children against COVID. A shot for children under age 5 could be available by the end of this month. A pediatrician will stop by to answer your questions. Plus, last night's discussion about Joe Rogan prompted some sharp feedback. Frankly, I've been thinking about it all day. We'll share some of it and see if we can't build on it to improve what we do here. And the New York Times now owns the hit word game Wordle. So what will become of it? We'll ask the man in charge of games for the Times what players want to know. Namely, will the game still be free? All right, parents, tonight's show is very much for you because there's a lot up for debate when it comes to public schools these days. Are kids better off learning virtually or in classrooms? Well, that debate's kind of settled. I think classrooms, right? But should they wear masks all day? And lately, another debate. How should schools deal with matters of race and identity, if they deal with it at all? Some state houses and school boards across the country are working to restrict discussions of race, gender, and sexuality in classrooms. In Florida, the Republican-led legislature just passed House Bill 1557, called the Parental Rights in Education Act. The bill states that school districts, quote, may not encourage classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels, unquote. Now, blowback to this bill has been swift. Some critics are calling it the Don't Say Gay bill. Those critics include the husband of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Chasten Buttigieg tweeted, quote, "This will kill kids, Governor DeSantis. You are purposefully making your state a harder place for LGBTQ kids to survive in. In a national survey, 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide last year. Now they can't talk to their teachers," unquote. Now, to be clear, this bill does not specifically ban all discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity. It just says that schools themselves cannot spark those discussions. Theoretically, students could talk about whatever they wanted. But we caught up with one Florida sophomore who's actively fighting the bill.
What they're doing isn't solving the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that students aren't feeling safe at school. They aren't feeling comfortable at school. And when a student doesn't feel safe or comfortable, they can't learn, and that's when the grades start dropping. And that's why a lot of times kids have higher suicidal rates, because they don't feel loved, they don't feel safe in their schools.
We also asked for your thoughts on this bill, and we got a lot of responses basically within minutes of asking. All the voicemails we got were in support of this measure. Here's what Amit from Miami left in our inbox.
I 100% agree with that. I don't think that the government should be getting involved. The kids should only be spoken to about gender by their parents, whether their parents are gay or whether their parents are straight. This is not a topic that needs to be dealt with outside of the family. I mean, it's very kind of annoying that people think they can talk to other children about these issues. These issues are very private and they're very personal, and they should be kept that way. Thanks.
Let's dive in with NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, who joins us from the Florida Capitol in Tallahassee. Vaughn, tell us a little bit more about this bill and particularly what grades it would apply to. The bill refers to primary grade levels, so we're referring to like more really young kids, right?
Actually, though, Joshua, here in the state of Florida, primary education, as deemed currently by the Florida Department of Education, is K through 12 here. And I think that is what hits at the heart of the complications of this bill that have been put forward by Republicans here in Florida, is just how open-ended it is. It says not only primary education, but then says age appropriate. And then the question is, who is one to determine what age appropriate is? Again, this hits at the heart of the potential limiting of free speech inside of the classroom, to the extent that educators can talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, not necessarily specifically about one student or one situation, but whether it be from LGBTQ history to situations involving here, you know, the basic premise of the existence of individuals who are gay. That is how open-ended this is, and why there is such pushback from particularly Democrats here in the LGBT community against this bill.
There's pushback from Democrats in Florida and, of course, LGBTQI activists. What about the Republicans who support it? What's their rationale for the bill?
That's the difficulty here. The rationale is kind of like the gentleman you heard in the voicemail there, the suggestion that these topics should be left to parents to discuss. Again, though, it hits at the heart of the complications that, you know, the LGBTQ community exists, and it exists in schools here. And that's why I wanted to talk with the chairman, the Republican chairman of the House Education Committee here, who voted just a couple days ago to approve the measure in that House committee there, and said he will vote again for it at in front of the full House. I want to let you listen to a part of our exchange. Why is talking about sexual orientation a problem with kids?
Because that's something that parents should be doing, not school employees.
And so what do you tell those young LGBT students here who are Florida residents here who feel like they're alienated?
They're not being alienated.
If they're not able to talk about sexual orientation and gender identity because the school...
No kid should be treated any differently than any other.
And as part of our back and forth, he then suggested that this was about sex. And I want to be very clear. In HB 1557, this has nothing to do with the idea of sex. He was saying that it's the birds and the bees conversation. But what this piece of legislation does is prohibits educators from discussing sexual orientation and gender identity. This has nothing to do with the act of sex.
There's another bill in Arizona that's somewhat similar. State Representative Daniel Hernandez spoke on that bill last week. Here's part of what he said.
Here we are debating whether or not, once again, to reinstitute a bill that would disallow us from having conversations about the LGBTQ community. The LGBTQ agenda is simple: to be treated with dignity and with respect, and to be given the opportunity to succeed just like every other Arizonan. This bill does not accomplish that. What this bill does is, once again, try and erase the LGBTQ community from Arizona public schools under the guise of protecting children.
Vaughn, tell us more about what's happening in Arizona. Particularly, I wonder if part of this it has to do with some of the political similarities between Florida and Arizona, at least, that both of them are rather red states, but they have some kind of strongly blue pockets. So there's a tension there in terms of how these cultural conversations are held.
You know, I think like here in Florida, there's these Republican majorities in the Florida House and Senate, as well as the Arizona House and the Senate. And this particular bill, what it does is it says that sexually explicit material should be barred from the classroom. But when it defines what sexually explicit material is, it says pornography, masturbation, and then, quote, homosexuality, which, of course, homosexuality is the existence of being gay. That is where, when we're looking at this piece of legislation, it is kind of confounding as to how a Republican legislature looks to ultimately ban that from existing in materials, whether it be books that include gay people, whether it be movies that depict gay communities, gay families. When it comes to LGBT history, how do you ban the discussion of homosexuality in materials? That is where some of these pieces of legislation are simply confusing to Democrats and concerning to the LGBT community. But at the same time, that bill, it passed the Arizona Education Committee in the House. The bill 1557 here in Florida, it passed the Education Committee here. So these bills have life to them, Joshua.
We should note that those of you at home who are watching this and have shared your thoughts on this, and by the way, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. There are some mixed opinions in our audience, different points of view from different folks about bills like this. KHB tweeted, "Did you ever try to stop a kid from asking a question? The kids recognize evasion and they will lose respect." And Ray tweeted, "Many have different opinions. That's a subject that should be discussed between the children and parents." Vaughn Hilliard is with us from Tallahassee, Florida. Vaughn, do stick with us because there's another bill that we want to talk to. Meanwhile, Florida lawmakers are also considering another bill to change how public school students are taught about race. House Bill 7 is advancing in the Florida legislature. Its Senate companion is awaiting approval by one more committee before it heads to the full body. Now, this bill came about after Governor Ron DeSantis announced a proposal back in December. He called it the Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act, the Stop Woke Act. During the announcement, the governor invoked the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
You think about what MLK stood for. He said he didn't want people judged on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. You listen to some of these people nowadays, they don't talk about that. I think what you see now with the rise of this woke ideology is an attempt to really delegitimize our history and to delegitimize our institutions.
The Stop Woke Act would have let parents sue schools that teach critical race theory. It also aimed to protect employees from work environments made hostile by critical race theory training. Now, Florida has already banned this from schools, despite there being no evidence that any public school in Florida actually teaches critical race theory. House Bill 7 is different from what the governor announced. It would limit how classrooms and workplaces discuss race-related concepts, and it asserts what its supporters consider a more appropriate view of race. Here are some examples on the screen. That no person is inherently racist or sexist or oppressive by virtue of his or her race or sex. That a person does not bear responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex, and that a person should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish on account of his or her race. This bill also replaces certain words in the state's non-discrimination policies. Ethnicity is replaced by color. Gender is replaced by sex. To be clear, those are not synonymous. Some people who look lily white have African ancestry. Go to Google and look up Walter White, not the character from Breaking Bad, the guy from the NAACP. His parents were slaves, but his light skin allowed him to infiltrate white supremacist meetings and investigate lynchings. Also, sex is an observable characteristic. Gender is part of your identity. Someone may look male or female, but identify as transgender, agender, or non-binary. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is back with us, still at the state capitol in Tallahassee. And Vaughn, I wonder what your sense is of how these bills lock together and how Governor DeSantis' Stop Woke Act factors into all of this.
You know, and I think it's important when we take into account and we try to all go back to when we were in school here, what school consisted of. History classes, U.S. history, world history. I'm from Arizona. I had an Arizona history class. I know here in Florida, they learn about Florida history. These conversations exist about our past, but also those individuals who lived a life very differently than perhaps I did. Just take into Tallahassee, this area here. You know, it was about 200 years ago in which U.S. troops, led by Andrew Jackson, forcibly removed multiple Native American tribes from these lands here. And that's where this bill really hits at the heart of. To what extent can those open and honest conversations and teachings happen with these students, with these educators here, and the parent ultimately having the ability to sue because, quote, discomfort. is if their student feels, quote, discomfort, that gives the parents the ability to sue. And that is where so much of this concern is rooted in. And that is where it's directly tied in with the conversation about sexual orientation and gender identity. These conversations that are at the very heart of our history and where we are in 2022, and why at a time in which you could say we are in the heart of culture wars here, a politically toxic environment right now, all of this is coming to a head, and it poses serious constitutional questions, but also, more importantly, what types of conversations are the students, this next generation, engaged in or not engaged in as a result of these types of measures?
Yeah, and as a native Floridian, I did indeed have to learn Florida history. And also, as a Palm Beach County native, I remember when Palm Beach County went through a whole process of integrating African-American history into the full curriculum. So I will be interested to know from individual districts in the state of Florida whether or not they have to rethink their curricula and kind of pull some of those plans out. Vaughn, if we step back from the cultural impact for a second just to the politics of this, it looks like these bills are going to become law. Like, I'm not sure how politically the opposition to these bills could succeed, considering the majorities in the state legislature and, frankly, just the political power of Governor DeSantis right now. So these kind of feel like done deals.
Sort of feel like done deals, and I think it speaks more to where we are nationally with our politics. Ron DeSantis is considered a front runner for the potential 2024 GOP nomination if, or even if not, Donald Trump were to run. Take that into account here. The potential governor would sign these pieces of legislation and would be a front runner here in this Republican Party. But also, if you take Mike Pence, you know, recall when he was the vice president of the United States, his wife, the second lady, Karen Pence, took a job in Virginia at a private school that barred gay individuals from either teaching at the school or from students themselves, gay students at that school, at that private school. This is sort of the mainstream arguments within this Republican Party here today, and we don't see it just here in Florida or Arizona. It's happening in Texas, Indiana. There's currently a measure that is making its way through the House in which it would ban inside of the classroom, quote, anti-American ideologies from being discussed. And again, that hits at the heart of what are those anti-American ideologies? What does that mean? So whether one believes that a student should be learning one way of history or another, that's up for debate. But ultimately, this could have true ramifications inside of the classrooms. And that is why we could expect these types of legislation, if passed and signed into law, to hit the courts. And then it's a matter of what happens from there.
One last piece of this bill before we have to move on from it. One line in House Bill 7 refers to, under a section that spells out some of the required instruction, refers to, quote, the arguments in support of adopting our Republican form of government, small r Republican, as they are embodied in the most important of the Federalist Papers. So, Vaughn, very briefly before I have to let you go, we should note these bills both proscribe and prescribe the way that curricula are presented. That's not unusual for a subject matter. It's just what the subject matter is that makes it unusual, makes it novel.
Right, and it's ultimately, it would be down to the educators to ultimately implement that. And not only implement it, but also in the back of your mind that parents or a community member may be suing you over your interpretation and understanding of history and the way you're teaching it. There's one other bill, right, SB 1300 here in Florida, which would make it easier for community members to object to material, to books being taught here in Florida schools here. And one of the attorneys who is speaking at the hearing here on behalf of that bill in support of it, she said that her paramount concern was that, quote, LGBTQ characters were being depicted in books. It's quite explicit what concerns of these community members are. Now it's a matter of whether these bills pass the legislature, if Ron DeSantis signs it, and then ultimately how these educators would implement them.
That's NBC's Vaughn Hilliard reporting for us tonight from Tallahassee, Florida. Vaughn, appreciate you making time. Thank you very much. Now, we will get to another aspect of teaching about race in just a moment. Our latest reporting on the process some districts in Texas are using or skipping to vet library books. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. You may have heard about books being removed from school libraries across the country. The Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel Mouse, about the Holocaust, pulled from an 8th grade curriculum in Tennessee. Toni Morrison's novel The Bluest Eye, pulled from a school district in Missouri. Texas has more than 1,200 school systems. NBC News looked into nearly 100 districts around the state's major cities, and we found 75 formal requests from parents or community leaders to ban books from libraries in the first 4 months of this school year. 75 requests. In the same period last year, one library book was challenged in those districts. Now, most of the books in question are about race or sexuality. In many cases, parents are the ones applying pressure. NBC's Mike Hicksenbaugh tweeted from his reporting, a parent asked administrators at Spring Branch Independent School District, that's in the greater Houston area, to pull the graphic novel Drama, which features gay and bisexual characters, because she claimed it might lead young students, quote, to question their sexual orientation when they don't even comprehend what that means, unquote. NBC's Antonia Hilton joins us now with more from her reporting. Antonia, paint us a clearer picture of how widespread this is right now. I mean, how many books are we talking about that have been either restricted or removed?
Joshua, we're talking about hundreds of books, and this is across districts in every region of the state of Texas. And it looks different at a local level. So I was just in Katy, Texas, which is right outside of Houston, and they have banned now 9 books, more than half of which feature LGBTQ characters. And they did this after they went through an internal review process. But there are other districts that we found in this investigation that have been removing books without following their own district policies, which require them to usually have school board meetings, to have administrators and librarians jointly read the book and discuss which grade levels it might be appropriate or not appropriate for. And they have essentially tossed their own district policies out the window. And when parents have come forward and complained about certain titles, just simply pulled them off the shelves, sometimes in droves, again, without following their own policies and without being subjected to much scrutiny, Joshua.
Do we have a sense of why they did this and whether there are any repercussions? I mean, it's school board policy to have these reviews. I presume it's not a crime to ignore the reviews. It's problematic, but I wonder what the rationale was for that and whether there's any recourse.
Well, several of these school districts would not respond to NBC News' requests for comment, wanting to discuss that exact issue, right? But what we've heard on the communal level, particularly from the parents who spoke with these administrators who fought for these books to be removed, is that they were so shocked by certain subjects, whether it was about abuse experienced by certain characters, discussions about sexuality and exploration of gender identity, that basically they looked at these things, decided they were immediately not appropriate for kids and didn't need to discuss it. Some of the parents who have fought for these, they tend to say things along the lines of, oh, this is content that's simply just inappropriate for any kid of any kind, of any background whatsoever. And so they paint sort of the appropriateness of these books with a very broad brush. Of course, when you talk to the kids who've read these books, the librarians who brought them into their collections and wanted to share them, they often say that these books have been part of the last several years of an effort to have more diverse books available to kids on their shelves. Many of these librarians will frankly admit to you that in their career, there have been periods where they didn't have enough books about Black kids, enough books about Asian American or Latino children, and that they had to go out of their way to find some of those materials. And that also applies to LGBTQ kids, that they needed resources in their libraries, and they realized in the past that they felt they didn't have enough. And so some of these books, or actually many of these books, are newer titles that these parents have become more recently aware of, but that previously librarians sought out because they were hearing from kids that they just weren't seeing themselves reflected on the shelves.
I wonder whether we can be real surgical about what's happening with these books. First of all, quite a few books about being LGBTQ have nothing to do with sexual activity. I mean, I was a gay kid growing up, and I think the books I was most looking for are books about not getting my butt kicked. So a lot of the story about being young and gay is not about sex, it's about avoiding violence or avoiding mistreatment. But with regard to the books themselves, a lot of these moves have been described as bans. Can you clarify that a little bit? Are these districts saying the book cannot exist in the district anywhere? Or are they saying if you are in these grades, you may read it? Like, drill into that a little bit for us. Be real precise.
You got it. It is a mix, Joshua. So in some cases, they've looked at titles and said, okay, we will continue to allow this for high schoolers, but we are going to take this out of libraries that are accessible to elementary or middle school age children. And then there are complete bans. For example, I just spoke with the author of a memoir titled All Boys Aren't Blue. The author is named George M. Johnson, and they are a queer Black person writing about their development of their identity, their discovery of who they are. And in about 4 or 5 paragraphs, they describe an incident of sexual abuse from their childhood. And those 4 or 5 paragraphs have become the basis for many parents of the push to get that book entirely banned. And that's what we've seen happen in many districts, actually not just in Texas, but around the country. And Katy, Texas, where I just mentioned I was the other day, has completely banned that book. So even high schoolers, students who are, in many cases, engaging in their own relationships, they do know about sex, they're taking sex ed classes, they have been deemed also not able to read this book that, again, has a couple pages that deal with an incident that is about abuse, that is about a reflection of a personal experience. And the author, when I spoke to them, told me that the goal was to give kids who'd been through these things or maybe had family members who experienced these things and didn't know other queer people that they could talk to about them, a space to do that, a vision of themselves out in the world. And they were really heartbroken to hear that now their story wasn't going to be accessible to kids who might be like them in districts in Texas or really anywhere else, Joshua.
I should note that those of you who wrote into us about this, again, had a variety of opinions on how you felt about school districts taking these kind of measures. C.A. Schmidt tweeted, "These R's," meaning Republicans, "talk about First Amendment, but they want to limit everything they don't like. A lot of books they want to ban are award winners. Talk about cancel culture." And Ray tweeted, "Trusting school administrations to treat sensitive situations fairly can lead us down a bumpy road. Let families discuss these issues at home so that children are not influenced by radical school administrations." Antonia, before I have to let you go, what's the next step in all of this? Are there more appeals of some of these pushes to remove and ban and restrict books, or is this just kind of proceeding unabated?
Well, when you talk to students and librarians who are seeing this day to day, they say that they think this is going to proceed unabated, that they see parents actually getting more emboldened, more aggressive about this. They're finding more and more books that they want to question and ask schools to remove. There's a question mark for authors, too, about, where is this going possibly legally? Are they going to be asking for my books to be taken off the shelves at city and public libraries? Are they going to go to my publisher? Are they going to go to book reviewers or booksellers and ask them to take these books off the shelves as well? So there's a real fear that there is a slippery slope here. I actually interviewed a mom who organizes parents around this and fights for book removals. And she said herself that, they think this fight is going to continue and they want to talk to some of the publishers and book reviewers and take this fight further. Some of this material they think is just simply unsuitable, period. And so for them, this is the beginning of a fight. They feel, very affirmed by the fact that many school districts have agreed with their views on these books, and they don't plan to stop anytime soon.
Thank you, Antonia. That's NBC's Antonia Hilton with more from Texas tonight. Now, we've got one more story about parents' concerns for their children, this time with the pandemic. Children under the age of 5 are one step closer to being vaccinated. Parents probably have a lot of questions about this. We'll answer some when we come back. Lots of parents have had the same question since the COVID vaccines came out. Are they safe for my children? This month, children as young as 6 months could be eligible for their shots. This afternoon, Pfizer asked the FDA to authorize its 2-dose vaccine for kids under the age of 5. But how much are parents on board with that? A new survey out today from the Kaiser Family Foundation shows not that much. Among parents with children younger than 5, only 3 in 10 say they will indeed vaccinate their kids right away. That's up from 2 in 10 back in July. More than a quarter of this parent group said they would definitely not vaccinate their child. So what should parents know before they make this decision for their kids? Let's ask Dr. Stanley Spinner. He is a pediatrician and Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Texas Children's Pediatrics and Texas Children's Urgent Care. Dr. Spinner, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So what is your top line on this news about the vaccine, the request for authorization? What's the main thing you think all parents with children under the age of 5 should know?
Well, this was a welcome piece of information for all of us, especially as pediatricians who recognize that children are not immune to COVID. They're not immune to the potential downside of COVID, meaning serious infection, hospitalization. We have over 1,000 kids have been hospitalized during this last surge, so it can be a serious infection for a lot of kids. We see, long COVID and potentially other long-term effects that we may not even have recognized yet. So this is an opportunity for our youngest of kids to get vaccinated and to get protected. Everyone's out and about now. Unfortunately, most people have, let down their guard, thinking that this is over, but it's not. We're a long way from being over. So, being able to protect our youngest children is so important, going forward.
Tell us what you're seeing these days, Doctor. Texas Children's Hospital is in Houston, where there's some gigantic medical complexes. So I imagine you're seeing lots of cases just by dint of the fact that you're in a large medical campus. But how are your doctors doing these days managing the flow of young patients?
Well, it's been a challenge. It's been larger numbers than we've ever seen. And the demand for kids to be seen, to be tested, concerns about what do I do with my child in school and daycare, when can they go back, what about, if this happened or that happened. But, families are very much, there's so much information out there and so much misinformation out there. So parents are very confused. And our physicians spend so much time trying to help them understand the reality of what COVID is, what it can do in all ages, including their young children, and also the amazing benefits and safety of the COVID vaccine.
What would you say are the main risk factors that affect children potentially with getting this vaccine?
I'm sorry, as far as the risk factors of the vaccine itself, or just for the child's health?
If there are any concerns, because you mentioned misinformation. I think one of the questionable lines of conversation that's come up sometimes around kids and COVID is the impact of vaccines, masks, of all kinds of preventive measures, whether or not kids would be safer to allow their natural, unique immunity to protect them from COVID, or to take a vaccine, which is relatively new, supported by years of science, but the vaccine itself is relatively new. How would you talk parents through that?
Okay, yeah. So the main thing for parents to understand is that, we do have extensive experience with this vaccine. Hundreds of millions of doses of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine have been given, certainly to the adults, to the adolescents, to our school-age kids. We do have, studies that have been ongoing now for several months for our young kids down to age 6 months. The safety profile has been absolutely unquestionable. The information that parents hear about as far as, some of the reactions that people get to vaccines, the reality is this: the majority of people, if they're going to have a reaction, it's going to be local. They're going to have some soreness in the arm. They're going to, maybe feel a little achy, get some fever. That goes away in a day or two, and that's, easily treated with some Tylenol. The benefits of the vaccine are extraordinary, even though, yes, we can see children, we can see adolescents and adults get COVID with the vaccine. The vaccine, even the 2 doses, let alone getting the booster for those that are eligible, has almost eliminated hospitalization for virtually all of them. There's going to be some rare exceptions, certainly. So the vaccine works extraordinarily well, better than any of us ever expected it to, honestly, and yet remains incredibly safe. Parents have to understand that if their child gets infected from COVID, we don't know how well they're going to do, because, again, many of them don't do well. We don't know how good of immunity they're going to get from the vaccine. Some get no immunity at all. Some get very short-lived immunity. But given the choice, as a parent, wouldn't you rather have your child get something that we know is effective, that we know is safe, versus getting infected, and we certainly don't know that it's safe to get infected. In many cases, it's not.
I want to know, by the way, for parents who are listening to this, you can go to planyourvaccine.com and get information on where to get shots and how to get your kids vaccinated quickly, quietly. Only you and your pediatrician need to know for sure. Doesn't need to be a big political thing. You can make a decision for your kids. if and when you decide to, planyourvaccine.com has information. You can also point the camera on your phone, open the camera app, and just scan that QR code. It'll take you right to planyourvaccine.com. Doctor, before I have to let you go briefly, I wonder what you would recommend in terms of just getting kids through this process, particularly kids who are afraid of needles. What do you find that you and your pediatricians tell children about what they're about to experience?
Well, what we tell children who are scared of needles, and this works, it worked for my own grandkids. We're telling them that we're not only protecting them against a very bad bug, we're keeping them from giving that bad bug to others, including members of their family who might get a lot sicker. So they're doing something, a great deed, not only for themselves, but for their loved ones and for their friends. And I can tell you that works very well for a lot of children. And of course, there's always the traditional rewards that you give your kids or you offer your kids if they're willing to get their vaccinations. We've always done that, but being able to tell them that they're helping to save others is an amazing, inducement for a lot of young kids.
Dr. Stanley Spinner of Texas Children's, I appreciate you making time, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Last night, we began the show talking about Joe Rogan's wildly popular yet controversial podcast on Spotify. A number of musicians, including Neil Young, have pulled their music from the app over COVID misinformation that has been in that podcast. Last night, we spoke to author and educator Irshad Manji about this. You may recall that she said, the big question is not the path forward for him, but for journalists like me.
When you and your colleagues become as transparent as Rogan's audience believes he is, that may be when you start getting the audience that you believe you deserve.
And you know what? I think she's got a point. And a lot of you had thoughts about this, especially on Ms. Manji's Twitter feed. Firas tweeted, personally, what I love about Joe Rogan is that he's able to sit down and have a civil talk with literally anyone. Agreeing with that person isn't a prerequisite, as it has become elsewhere, echo chambers. Sharing platforms seems to be equal to sharing ideas and being identical. And Michael tweeted, fantastic point at the end. A little humility and at least a pretense of objectivity would go a long way toward the restoration of faith in journalism. And as much as I like Joshua, he seemed a little reticent at the idea of full transparency. Not so, Michael. Transparency fits perfectly into our mission. We're here to foster connection, to lead America's national conversation. That's why I thought this feedback was spot on. That's why I read your tweet. But first, we could use some clarity from all of you, some more feedback. What do you think of Now Tonight? What do you like about this show? What would you like us to do differently, or more of, or stop doing? We'd love to hear from you. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also reach out to us directly by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or you can email us, nowtonight@nbcnews.com. These days, it's hard for many companies to retain top talent, but some businesses are finding success by giving employees a stake. We'll explain how it works just ahead. Stay close. The Great Resignation. 3 words that pretty much defined America's labor force during the second half of 2021. Now it looks like that trend is starting to taper off. The Bureau of Labor Statistics released new data on resignations, or quits, as they call it. Monthly quits went from 4.5 million in November to 4.3 million in December. And the job market remains hot. There were nearly 11 million openings in December. That's a modest increase from November. Also, 6.3 million Americans were unemployed in December. It's that lower line. So theoretically, that means nearly 2 available jobs for each of them. That is the most on record going back about 20 years. Now, despite all of this, millions of workers are still quitting in search of a better job or better lifestyle or more money. But some businesses have another way to retain employees. NBC senior consumer investigative correspondent Vicki Nguyen has that story.
Michael Aiken works for Johnny's Pizza House in Shreveport, Louisiana. He started as a high school junior in 2008, but after a few years, Michael received a statement on top of his normal paycheck confirming he owned a piece of the company.
And I saw that, oh, such and such amount of stock, and this is your cash value amount of your account. It was, oh, wow, I'm a part of something that's bigger than me, and I can watch something grow.
So how did it happen? Johnny's offers an ESOP, or Employee Stock Ownership Plan. Workers get a slice of the company after 3 years on the job. They can cash out when they leave Johnny's or save until retirement. Michael has now been there for 13 years. He trains employees and helps open new restaurants.
Well, how much of this ownership program played a role in you being there for so many years?
Well, I would say it played a definite role in it. More of your heart goes into your work because you see that statement.
There are 6,500 employee-owned companies in the U.S., names you'd recognize. Cliff Bar with just over 1,000 employees. W.L. Gore, they make Gore-Tex fabric with over 11,000 workers. The nation's largest ESOP, Florida-based Publix grocery stores with 225,000 employees.
Employee-owned businesses tend to have lower turnover and more loyal employees.
Joseph Blasi is a Rutgers professor specializing in employee ownership. A recent report shows these companies fared much better than non-employee owned companies over the past 2 years. They retained workers at a rate of 4 to 1. Another study found employees at ESOPs had twice the amount of money in their retirement accounts, $132,000 on average.
Most ESOP companies also share cash profits every year with employees, typically in excess of 10% on top of wages.
According to Blasi, if you want to work for an ESOP, expect to be more involved in corporate matters and also share more business-related information with coworkers. And it takes commitment. Maximum wealth comes at retirement.
Some employees, especially in ESOPs, if they're younger, they don't want to wait until retirement to get that big wealth nest egg.
At Johnny's Pizza House, Michael's nest egg has been growing since 2008. The company's CEO tells NBC News multiple employees have retired, cashing out more than $1 million.
People might say, but you work at a pizza restaurant. How is this possible?
It's definitely possible as long as you're taking care of whoever comes through the door and taking care of the things in your four walls and you're making sure your customers are taken care of and coming back. I mean, it's going to work.
That was NBC's Vicki Nguyen reporting. I'm thinking of a 5-letter word, starts with M, ends with Y, and it describes the New York Times buying the word game Wordle. Maybe you guessed money. But some players say by the time this app goes corporate, the answer could be messy. A Times exec spells out what's in store for Wordle before we go. If you play Wordle, you might have to change your bookmark. Soon it could take you to nytimes.com. This free game that started as a personal project just got acquired by the New York Times. The company just bought Wordle for a 7-figure sum from its creator, Josh Wardle. Lately, the game has exploded online with millions of daily players. Wordle gives you 6 chances to guess a 5-letter word. A correct letter has a yellow square. Correct letters in the correct spot have green squares. Currently, it can only be played once a day. And currently is the key. Will it stay that way? It's also free to play, but some of you told us you're worried about how this game will change. Let's put some of your questions to Jonathan Knight. He's the general manager of games at the New York Times. Mr. Knight, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Why did the New York Times buy Wordle?
We bought Wordle because it's an awesome game. It fits, really well with our portfolio of games. We have crossword, spelling bee. We're really aligned with Josh, the creator, on the type of games that we think make sense for the Times. And it's like really popular. It's awesome. It fits with us, and that's the main reason we bought it.
Why does Josh Wardle need the New York Times? Was there anything more to the deal besides money? I mean, what did you offer?
Well, look, I don't want to speak for him, but he has said that he was a bit overwhelmed at the unexpected popularity of the game. It takes a lot of time, energy, engineers, and a team to kind of support a game that's this popular. So, he felt really great about New York Times being kind of the stewards of the game going forward. We want to, make sure that we have a great user experience. We want to be able to, make sure people's stats and streaks are maintained, and really just make sure the game has an amazing future.
Forgive me for being skeptical, but what more is there to maintaining Wordle than picking a different 5-letter word every day?
Well, look, I don't want to predict the future. There's so many things that, we could do to make the game great. And, people really care about their streaks over time and their stats, getting better at the game, having those kind of accomplishments and building, a long-term relationship with the game. So, there is a fair amount to operating games. And, we also are excited to introduce the New York Times audience to Wordle, to introduce the Wordle audience to, the other games and the other products that are part of the New York Times.
Talk about the Wordle audience compared to, say, the New York Times audience that plays the games that are already on the site. Like, how many people play Wordle right now?
Well, we're not going to disclose those numbers publicly. It's millions of people are playing every day. There's millions of people coming to the New York Times games. And we just think it fits well, and we're excited to continue to grow that audience.
Are we talking 10 million, more than 10 million, fewer than 10 million?
Yeah, sorry, Josh, I don't have any numbers to give out.
I wonder what the future of the game looks like in particular. I mean, we heard from a number of our viewers who have some real concerns about the future of the game. Mary tweeted, "I'll believe the free and no changes part of this when I see it." And JZP Mima tweeted, "Enjoy it, but not enough to pay." I have to wonder if the New York Times can own Wordle without some kind of monetization strategy, either paying for versions of the game, like you do with a crossword, or having some kind of ads. I mean, the New York Times is not a not-for-profit. It's not a charity. So what's the strategy for making Wordle worth it for the Times?
I mean, I can say, 100% our focus is to continue what makes this game special. So we are really sensitive to the fact that the game is so popular, that people love it, that, it feels like it belongs to all of us. And, we want to be stewards of the game and continue that. There's all kinds of value that the New York Times can glean from just creating more engagement in our ecosystem with, like I said, with all of our products. And, we're just not kind of focused right now on that. We're focused on making sure the game continues as is, making sure that people have a seamless transition when we move it over, that their stats are maintained. And, by and large, people should not notice a difference. We love the game.
But will it still be a free game? Will people have to pay to play the game?
When it comes to New York Times, it'll continue to be free to play. We're focused on letting people continue the same experience they have. And that's like 100% what we're thinking about right now.
One more viewer response I'd like to get to. Emily writes, "Wordle grew organically through word of mouth and then people sharing their little yellow and green boxes on social media. It takes 5 minutes. There's only one a day. You're not competing with anyone else, but it's in the zeitgeist. This is an ideal moment. When the New York Times ultimately slaps Wordle behind their paywall and ads, rankings, and levels and mini Wordles or whatever they do, it stops being egalitarian and becomes another New York Times product. For players who are concerned about the game not being, for lack of a better word, special anymore, having that quality it had before, how would you reassure them, briefly?
I mean, I would encourage them to play the crossword mini every day. I'd encourage them to play the spelling bee. If you play our other games, the crossword mini is something you can do in 2 minutes a day. It's 100% free to play for anyone. The spelling bee is beloved for the fact that, it's time well spent. It doesn't demand much of you. It's a wonderful little puzzle to be solved and shared with friends. Josh Wordle, the creator of Wordle, the reason he chose to go with the Times is that he's a big fan of the mini. He's a big fan of spelling bee and frankly was sort of inspired by our games. So our values are aligned, and I would just, encourage that person that wrote in to, play our other games and see for themselves.
One last real quick question before I let you go. As a game show fan, the minute I saw Wordle, I was like, that's lingo. It is the exact same core concept as the game show Lingo. It's running right now on ITV in the UK. Chuck Woolery hosted Lingo for the Game Show Network. It feels like you acquired a game that lifted a concept from another game show. Any concerns about that?
Games are borrowing things from other games all the time. We don't have the only crossword puzzle out there. We don't have the only Pangram out there. There's lots of word games that are putting together different concepts from, a great history and a great,
right.
Series of games, throughout time. Like, what Wordle has done is put together elements in a really unique and innovative way. The sharing mechanic is completely brand new. So we feel confident that it's a really unique and special game.
Jonathan Knight from the New York Times. Mr. Knight, I appreciate you making time for us. Thank you very much. And hey, thank you for making time for us. Please do come on back tomorrow. Remember to send us your feedback on this program. We want to know what we're doing well, what we could do better. Reach us on social media, voicemail, or email us now tonight at NBCnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. See you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.